the focus of this conference, about network policing. What is it? Where's it come from? What are the benefits and challenges that accrue to policing partnerships? And also, towards the end, to say something about what the challenges that lie ahead might be. In doing so, I will sketch out a deliberately broad canvas and leave it to some of the other speakers to fill in some of the more specific details, because I think it is important, in many senses, to place today's debates and discussions in a slightly wider, both historic but also conceptual frame. And so what I will do, in some senses, is reflect critically, but hopefully in the best sense of that word, upon what I believe are some of the challenges, but also some of the real opportunities, because it seems to me there are some significant opportunities that lie ahead. And in some senses, as was implied by Bill, for me it's something of a personal journey. My first book, that was my PhD, published in 1997, and for which I was working on in the early 90s, was entitled The Local Governance of Crime, Appeals to Community and Partnership. So as Bill suggested, this is by no means a new thing, and in some senses I want to reflect a little bit back on kind of 30 years of observing, researching the development of networks and the development of partnerships across that period of time. It's also something of an auspicious occasion for me, because I literally last week signed a contract with publishers to write a book which is entitled Network Policing. So I put pen to paper in January and begin on that endeavour. So I'm very interested to hear what colleagues have to say across the day. So, as Rick said, in many senses, where we are today is constructed and the challenges produced in large part for what we have constructed over many centuries. And in many senses, as Bill recognised, the very idea of the recognition of the challenges of working through partnerships and in networks has been one that's been set out for some time. A recognition sometime in the 70s and 80s, and I think in some senses the kind of overdue recognition in the 1980s in the interdepartmental circular. This was in some senses the British government's light bulb moment in 1984 when it published the interdepartmental circular, at the heart of which is that emboldened statement: since some of the factors affecting crime lie outside the control or direct influence of the police, crime prevention cannot be left for them alone. Now, this recognition that the challenge is that we've constructed modern bureaucracies, as Rick suggested, which have hierarchical command and control forms and which respond poorly to some of the challenges of cross-cutting problems, of which crime and policing are essentially one. So the drivers of contemporary change that have increased since the 1980s, the speed of that change has become greater and led to some of the kind of factors of complexity that Rick touched upon. The globalisation and internationalisation of social networks, but also of crime itself and hence policing, means that also, and of communications, means that some of the challenges, some of the local consequences of crime are actually produced very far afield. They straddle, they traverse the capacity of the nation state to respond. The interconnected nature of transnational security risks and threats has become increasing over the time. The diffusion of risks with interdependencies and recursive feedback loops such that things that happen far away have implications. Probably the kind of classic example of that in the contemporary context is climate change. That climate change and the consequences for movement of people as we get the increasing development of deserts in some parts of the world has knock-on implications, criminal ones often, in terms of people trafficking, in terms of crossing borders, etc., as well as the movement. Exacerbated, as we know, by new information and communication technologies, and an increasing transformation in what we recognise the state to be. So that the state itself, since the 1980s in particular, has undergone significant change, as has our openness and ability to use information. the big data revolution in terms of the volume, variety and velocity present real challenges, but also significant opportunities for policing. So we live, in many senses, in an increasingly networked society, where their interconnections straddle our traditional borders and boundaries, our disciplines, our institutions that we've constructed. Crime, therefore, has also become increasingly networked. Digital technologies have caused social behaviour across networks to become global, informational and distributed. New forms of non-physical social relationships act as sources of new criminal opportunities. Sexting, as an example, just one example of that. Knowledge production itself, for us working in universities, there are significant challenges. The way in which we produce knowledge has become socially distributed. The ivory towers that held on to knowledge and produced knowledge now have to work in a much more distributed form. There are increasing data workers in various industries, professions and sectors, and also the public has become more knowledgeable, more easy to access information that they can use for different ends. Therefore, policing must, in many senses, adapt to those challenges and to those changes. As Bill suggested, this is not new. This is not new conceptually in many senses, and just kind of four, not random, but four kind of precursors to this: wicked issues, rat problems, co-productions and POP. That to take those in order, the whole notion of wicked problems, as Rittel and Weber set out in the 1970s, the idea that there are wicked problems that are multiple, that are complex, which have interdependencies and therefore require new ways of solving through distributed means. John Mudd, evocatively in an American context, talked about the rat problem to illustrate the siloed nature of neighbourhood services. The rat problem, he says, as the quote illustrates, that what does one do with a rat problem depends upon what the rat does and the different services that respond to it and how it's done. Wilson and Kelling picked up in a little-known, actually, paper, not their famous broken windows paper, but a little-known paper, picked up that Mudd's analogy, suggesting a police officer who takes public complaints about rats seriously will go crazy trying to figure out what agency in the city has responsibility for rat control and then inducing it to kill the rats. The complexity of the services that we've constructed are bureaucratic solutions. They aren't problem-based of their nature. Eleanor Ostrom, the only, to date, the only woman to have won the Economics Nobel Prize for her work around co-production, emphasised the point that Rick was making about the importance, and in doing so did it in relation to policing, back in Chicago in the 1970s, with regard to the need for policing to be co-produced with members of the public, with local communities. Herman Goldstein, who only just a few weeks ago won the criminological equivalent of the Nobel Prize, the Stockholm Prize, for his work around problem-oriented policing in the late 1970s, identifying the need for policing to shift towards problem-based, using problems as a starting point, rather than the services that we provided to respond to those problems. These are all, in many senses, tackling and trying to address similar sets of issues around the need to shift from the traditional bureaucratic processes that we've developed in state institutions to networked means of delivering them, away from fragmentations and silos, a state-centred lens for constructing problems, from hierarchical relations, from reacting to problems after they occur, focusing upon only institutional means rather than the problem-oriented ends, towards more de-differentiated, cross-cutting, joined-up, polycentric means which are not linear, but actually think non-linear in terms of non-linearity, in terms of the different levers that may influence a particular problem, and the active involvement of citizens as co-producers of public services. To say the same point illustratively, away from that kind of the traditional model of the police officer as the provider of solutions alone, towards one which links policing, embeds policing in much more complex networks, working alongside with and co-producing responses with other partners. Away from seeing problems in linear forms to seeing those problems in much more complex, wicked forms in terms of how they respond. This slide is, I suppose, what I'm trying to do here is suggest that actually we need to think through. We need to think a little bit about what we mean by networks. And one way of doing that is to differentiate them from other forms of relationships. Bureaucracies and contracts are different. Sometimes when we talk about partnerships, we actually are often talking about contractual relationships rather than genuine networked relationships. And so a little bit of clarity, a little bit of conceptual clarity about how we differentiate between the types of institutions and therefore the types of relationships. So when we're talking about networks, we're by and large talking about connected relationships, relationships between different, we might call them nodes or different institutions. Partners is another language. But networks constitute various different elements. Negotiation becomes the main form or basis of the relationship. That it's about reciprocity of relationship. It's about trust rather than relying on authority or in the contractual form, price. It's about interdependence between the partners. It's about shared responsibility rather than hierarchical chains or responsibility transferring in a legal sense. And that causes, and I'll come back to this, certain problems in terms of responsibility. But it's also about deliberation and diplomacy. So the nature of the relations, the connected relations, is a very different one. And it's a very different one which I suggest departs from our traditional way of thinking in terms of the state, but it also departs upon what often we've seen as a shift away from the state to the private sector in terms of simple contractual relationships. Networks are different and sit somewhere in, between and away from those. But in terms of the purpose, to pick up Rick's point, the purpose of networks is really about collaborative advantage. How do we combine effectively the contributions of those different plural actors, knowledgeable and competent, towards clear shared understandings of the problems that generate confidence in the capacity to respond? Collaborative advantage, therefore, is gained through collaboration when something is achieved that could not be achieved by any organisation acting alone. That's the nature of the world in which we live. However, collaborative inertia, as Vangen and Huxham have highlighted, relates to the often pertaining actual outcome in which collaboration mainly only makes hard-fought or negligible process. And there's often a tension, and I think Rick was also highlighting, between the rhetoric of partnerships and rhetorics of networks and the reality of falling back on traditional ways of working and bureaucratic forms. And in some senses, looking back on the 30 years, you know, one might say, well, actually, some of that, and particularly if one takes, for example, the work that I did in the early 90s was pre-Crime and Disorder Act. And, of course, the Crime and Disorder Act introducing crime and disorder reduction partnerships was, in some senses, a great opportunity to attempt to institutionalise through law, a state-centred means of delivering it, which is slightly contradictory, but anyway, that what that constituted was a way of actually trying to develop network relationships. And in the honeymoon years of post-1998, there was, I think, a lot of optimism about the capacity to actually deliver services in new ways. I think if we reflect back now, that some of that optimism may have run away with itself, that the cup is both half full. I think significant changes have happened since the late 1990s. But on the other hand, it is also half empty. But actually, if one was to look across the piece, I think we see a very uneven set of developments. And that's something I just want to come on and say something about. The uneven, constrained, contested, and also some senses precarious. Because at the heart of networks is a paradox. And the paradox is that the possibility for collaborative advantage rests in most cases on drawing synergies from differences between organisations, different resources, skills, capacities, etc. Yet those same differences stem from different organisational purposes. And these inevitably mean that they will seek different benefits from each other out of the collaboration. And it's that search for difference and the tension between those different priorities which constitute both some of the liveliness. I think one of the things I want to suggest, actually that creates some opportunities, which I think are often missed, but also is a challenge. So, well known to many in the room, I'm sure, are the barriers about which research has had much to say in relation to partnership working, in relation to networks in policing, reluctance of some agencies to participate, dominance of certain agendas, often policing agendas, unwillingness to share information. I think data sharing remains one of the most intractable and contentious problems of partnership relations. And it's one that has been a recurring set of problems over the time. There are technological, cultural barriers that undermine partnership working in terms of information exchange. Given, you know, the big data world in which we live, the fact that data still remains one of those intractable problems, I think, is a real challenge. There are conflicting interests, conflicting political differences, into organisational trust still remains, and trust in terms of the way in which cross-institutional, cross-professional understanding. There are still significant misunderstandings, both about the capacities but also about the limitations of other organisations. Desires to protect budgets, lack of capacity and expertise still, and over-reliance sometimes on informal contexts or informal networks. Patchy involvement, I think, from the voluntary sector. Significant coordination challenges, differential power relations. Still that question, I think, as Rick highlighted, about kind of giving up power still becomes, I think, a real challenge for many organisations, particularly large bureaucracies. Significant problems of joining up. Short-termism often in terms of the relationship. Some of that's driven by funding, but some of it's driven by narrow horizons. Also, I think one of the things that's happened since the kind of 1990s was actually a period in which there was significant intra-organisational focus. Now, some of the new public management reforms actually encouraged organisations, state bureaucracies in particular, to look inwardly on their own core performance indicators, often therefore at the distraction from those kind of peripheral connected priorities that they had with others. And I think that's partly been, I think, one of the difficulties of the crime and what became the community safety partnerships was precisely that focus to return partners to core objectives. And the whole notion of cooperation, collaboration, when competition still marks the relationships between many partners. The partners, on one hand, are competing. The problem of accountability is, I suppose, the problem, and this is one that really still needs to be grappled with, I think. And part of the reason for, I suppose, highlighting the challenges is in order to go through those, I think we need to think around them. So the problem of many hands, as Rod Rhodes illustrated, is that so many people contribute, but that no one contribution can be identified, and no one person can be held accountable after the event, then no one needs to behave responsibly before. I think that's reflective of a mindset which still has individual responsibility as at the heart of it, rather than notions of shared responsibility which networks demand. There are some real issues, and I think there's some positive but also critical ones around police culture, around culture of institutional defensiveness and suspicion of outsiders, which has marked elements of British policing, particularly some of the more notorious events that have occurred over the years. There is a tendency of the police still to do it alone. They have a can-do action culture, which often, and a 24-hour, let's be honest. One of the difficulties working with social workers go home at weekends. Police don't. And there are some real kind of challenges of how you work that kind of different organisational mindsets and working approaches. This rapidity, the speed of being able to respond, often through precisely those hierarchical command and controls. They enable fast responses as a consequence. So partnership working can be often seen or justified as a means of reducing demand. So there's a concern that actually, rather than the benefits that accrue, actually passing responsibility can be seen to it. To do that. So effective partnerships, I think what we learn from the research over time is that there are a number of elements to effective partnership working, and they coalesce, and those are just some of those that I've already touched on, but really illustrating there. What I want to do, just briefly in the time I have left, is just to think about that variability, because I think actually there's some significant differences, and I just want to draw very briefly on three areas in which I think that notion of networks are still at very different levels. And there are three areas in which I've been doing research in recent years, and could say a lot more, but I'll keep it very, very brief. One is in the public sector, so the kind of community safety, but also safeguarding work, children's safeguarding work. The other is in relation to the private sector. We think there's different sets of challenges, but real challenges. And thirdly, in relation to universities and knowledge production and generation. So very briefly. Firstly, around safeguarding children, I think there's some, that is if one was to take a particular test case. In the 1980s, we had the Butler-Sloss report into Cleveland, which identifies systemic problems between the different agencies. You read some of the reports more recently around child sexual exploitation, much the same institutional failings exist. That constitute, while the policy may have shifted, the practice still remains, the institutional flaws are there. We did some research in Leeds Children's Safeguarding a year or so ago, some really interesting and developed practice around safeguarding hubs and bringing together particularly co-located different agencies. And what I think, the really positive lesson that I think we can take from that is actually the development of interprofessional relations at the front line. And there are some really positive things about cross-institutional learning through working together. I think one of the challenges for organisations is how that knowledge, how that experience, how those practices are then drawn back into the organisations. Because like Rick suggested, too much of that is left in some senses on the peripheries of organisations doing really good work. So how do we mainstream some of the shifts and the changes that are happening in some of those co-located boundary work locations, which prompt some of that organisational learning, critical reflection on ways of working, data sharing, information sharing that is happening. Very, very positive effects there. So there's much to learn, I think, from really good workings around that. I haven't got time to go through this, but one of the key elements there was about what they called in Leeds the professional conversation. That recognising differences, acknowledging differences, but being clear about different contributions and the benefits of those different contributions, the nature of conflict management, being overt about conflict, there are conflicting priorities, but being able to discuss those in a mature and open way, I think was key to the values of that which was taken. That challenge should be accepted. That the ways in which other organisations see problems actually adds to the way in which specific organisations can address their own. The second example is in relation to the private sector. I think there's been a significant development over the years in terms of the relative maturing of the private sector, private security industry, the Security Industry Act and the Security Industry Authority. And I think in some areas where I think there's a greater necessity and maybe a greater high profile around counter-terrorism and cybercrime, where I think there are some really important and new developments that are taking place. In some sense, the nature of the problem demands increasingly, given the role of the private sector, much closer workings. But I think in the more mundane areas of policing and community safety, there's still a long way to go. There's still a long way to move towards actually harnessing the contributions that the private sector can make to public safety, and there's some real challenges that need to be overcome. At the moment, there is still too often indifference, competition, and in some senses, hostility. In terms of the relationships with universities, I think there's so much more that the policing can do, particularly in times of austerity, in terms of untapping knowledge and working with institutions to try and move beyond what was categorised as a dialogue of the deaf between the evidence and knowledge generation and a policing culture which is still very much rooted less in evidence and more in the kind of experiential learning that happens on the streets. Drawing together the two, rather than seeing one as always trumping the other, I think is important. Some work that I've been doing with colleagues in the north of England around the N8 Policing Research Partnership has been trying to do precisely that. But we're still very much at the foothills of doing it. And in some senses, the challenges of partnership working from both sides. This is not just about changing the way in which the police use, understand and value knowledge and evidence. It's also changing the way in which academics and universities actually engage with and make their work relevant to policing partners. So I think there's some challenges, particularly with regard to austerity and particularly with regard to public sector cuts in terms of, on the one hand, do organisations, public sector, retreat into their silos? I think we've seen some of that happening. But on the other hand, I think there's also an urge to innovate. There's an urge, a challenge driven by budgets to actually think radically differently. And often that's about thinking about prevention rather than the traditional fire brigade reacting to problems from a policing. How can partnerships help move services upstream in terms of prevention? So I'm going to conclude. I'm aware of time. So I think that network policing provides opportunities to harness the knowledge, skills and resources of diverse actors from the public sector, the civil society, in the furtherance of community safety. Advantages derive not simply from combining perspectives and resources and skills, but also in framing and shaping the problems differently and the methods of responding to them. It allows from problem-oriented approaches and a commitment to greater emphasis upon prevention. So I think shifting policing towards problem orientation, towards prevention and towards an evidence base are connected to and linked into, I would suggest, developing networks in ways that afford the potential to foster police as learning organisations that value the generation, mobilisation and application of knowledge. Thank you.